Guten Tag, once again, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, that's right, you get a German greeting again today. As we look at the Protestant Reformation, the setting is still Germany, northern Germany to be exact, so yeah, German greeting again. We kind of alluded to the Protestant Reformation a little bit in our last session as we examined how the ideas of the Renaissance spread northward into places like Germany and the Netherlands, and how humanism took on a very religious tone in those places, geared specifically towards wanting to reform the church. Well, those ideas are going to sort of come to fruition here in today's session as we look at the Protestant Reformation, an event that will change the religious landscape of Europe, that will rip Catholicism apart once again, and forever change the course of events in Western European history. The Protestant Reformation, that's where we are in today's session. So let's look at the essential questions. Specifically, how is the Protestant Reformation driven by the Renaissance? Because it really is. If there is no Renaissance, then there is really no Protestant Reformation taking place. How do the ideas and philosophies of the Renaissance lead to the calls for reformation of the Catholic Church, lead to the start of the Reformation? Then we'll get into the Protestant Reformation itself, and we'll start with the person who is credited with starting the Protestant Reformation, the dapper fellow on the left with the nifty haircut, a German monk by the name of Martin Luther. So we'll meet him, figure out who he is, and then find out how exactly he got this Protestant Reformation ball rolling. Finally, we'll sort of wrap up with what the immediate impact of the Protestant Reformation is. It's got far-reaching impacts, but just in Luther's time, we'll sort of look at what was the immediate impact that the Protestant Reformation is going to have on the religious makeup of Europe, because the impacts of the Protestant Reformation will be far and wide, but we'll wrap today with just sort of the short-term stuff in Luther's lifetime. So those are the essential questions. That's where we are headed today. Thus, without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. All right, so we talk about this whole thing being sort of driven by the Renaissance. The Renaissance values of humanism and secularism. Remember, secularism being a focus on non-religious things. The idea that people were focusing much more on life on this earth than an afterlife. People were still religious, but thinking more about life on this earth. Well, this greatly influences the way that people think throughout Europe. And so the ideas of the Renaissance are encouraging people to think more about human emotions, focus more on life on this earth, in this world, rather than life after death. And it causes them to take a much more critical look at the Catholic Church. Remember, people are still religious, and criticism of the Church is not something new, but now they're looking at it through a new lens. And people are becoming much more critical of the wealth and extravagance of the church. And on the one hand, they talk about being, pious and vows of poverty, and yet you have Renaissance era popes who live lives of wealth and luxury and extravagance, like the Pope at the time of our story here, Giovanni de' Medici, otherwise known as Pope Leo X, one of the more corrupt popes in all of papal history, definitely in my top 10, I think. So people like this guy, and really church leaders across the board, are being viewed as increasingly corrupt, and with the ideas of the Renaissance, more and more people are looking at the church and criticizing it in a different way. And all of this is leading to people by the 1500s calling for a reformation of the Catholic Church. I mean, all the influence of the Renaissance ideas, by the 1500s, people are looking for reformation. Reformation, it just means reform. They want people to, or they want the church to sort of reform the way that it teaches and practices Christianity. And different folks throughout Europe have different views on what reform means, but in general, there are very widespread calls for reform to the way the church teaches and practices Christianity. And ultimately, this is going to create a new schism or split in the Catholic Church. We saw a schism before, the Great Schism, that split the Roman Catholic West from the Orthodox East. Well, now we'll have a new schism that's going to split the Catholic Church once again and produce another new form of Christianity called Protestantism. And this whole Protestant Reformation begins with a German monk by the name of Martin Luther. That's him, good-looking guy there on the right with a hat. You can't see his bald spot. Born in 1483, Martin Luther was a very deeply religious guy, really his entire life. And in his heart, he really wanted to go to the monastery, wanted to serve, the church and have a life devoted to God. But Dad wanted him to become a lawyer. So, he honors his father's wishes and he enters law school. But, it doesn't last. He never really feels right. Doesn't feel like he's in the right place. And in 1505, he leaves law school to join the Catholic monastery, which of course made Dad pretty mad. He and his father had a very strange relationship for a long time after that. But the reason he left law school, according to Martin Luther, is a near-death experience. According to Martin Luther, he's traveling one day on his way home, and a big storm brews up, and he's in the countryside, in the woods, and the storm is incredibly, incredibly nasty, and he is almost struck by lightning, not once, but twice, and he believes that this is a sign from God. He believes God is angry with him for not pursuing a religious career, and so in the middle of this storm, he drops to his knees, and he prays, and he begs God for forgiveness, and promises that if he survives the storm, he'll quit law school and enter the monastery. And lo and behold, he survived the storm. And what did he do? He quit law school, and he entered the Catholic monastery. And being a deeply, deeply religious individual, Luther dives headlong into life at the monastery. He studies the Bible very, very heavily. He spends hours and hours a day in confession, almost to the point of annoyance to the people who would hear his confessions. I'm not sure what he was confessing at that point, probably discussing theology more than anything else. But he studies the Bible very, very heavily, really trying to find what really touches him and what he truly believes in the church. And during his studies of the Bible, he comes to believe in a doctrine of his own making, something that he called justification by faith. And so through study of the Bible, Luther came to believe that a person could achieve salvation, become just, simply by believing in God, having faith. Justification by faith. You could achieve salvation not by taking part in the sacraments, not by going on the crusades, but you could achieve salvation simply by believing in God, having faith in God. And this ideology will drive everything that Martin Luther does from here on out. It's going to be important in just a bit, but let's step away from Martin Luther for a minute, because during the time that Martin Luther is in the monastery, becoming a monk, and then eventually becoming a priest, we're seeing some of the most corrupt things that you're going to find the church doing in all of its history. During this time, the aforementioned Pope Leo X is trying to raise money for the church in order to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. By now, St. Peter's Basilica is really, really old, and it needs a facelift, and that's going to cost lots and lots of money, and he's looking for ways to raise that money. Well, in order to raise that money, the Pope begins selling church positions to his friends. What does that mean? It's like pay for play. You want to be a bishop? That's going to cost you. You want to be a cardinal? It's going to cost you. You want to get in good with the church? It's going to cost you. It's all ways to raise money to pay for the renovation of St. Peter's Basilica. Now, he also authorized the sale of something called plenary indulgences. And this is a practice that had been used in the past, but not very widespread. And indulgences are, the whole thing, it's a crock, it's a scam, but let me just explain what they are. Indulgences were certificates that, issued by the Pope, in theory, could reduce or cancel punishments for your sins. So think about the game Monopoly, and you have the get-out-of-jail-free card. Essentially, the indulgence would have been a get-out-of-hell-free card, or at least this is what people thought, because as they bought indulgences, they believed that this was guaranteeing them a place in heaven. They believed that this was essentially their ticket through the pearly gates to salvation. And no one tried to dissuade them from this idea, because what is the church trying to get by selling indulgences? They're trying to get money. And so the idea that people will think, yes, I'm buying a ticket to heaven, is all the better, because all the church wants to do is raise money in order to fund the renovation of St. Peter's Basilica. And this is what indulgences are. It's supposed to cancel your punishment for your sins. In sort of the most brazen episode in this whole messed up scenario, you had like regional indulgence salesmen throughout Europe. And the guy who was the regional salesman in northern Germany was a monk by the name of John Tetzel. And this guy even went so far as to promise people that if they bought indulgences, they could relieve themselves of punishments for future sins. That's right, for future sins. So, you think you might knock off a liquor store later, you better buy a couple extra indulgences. Is it possible that you might, commit murder or adultery or steal something, maybe even become a heretic, who knows, buy some extra indulgences to relieve yourself of punishment for future sins. Now, of course, the indulgences weren't going to get you out of major things, but the whole idea of being able to buy your way into salvation and buy, relief from your sins is ridiculous. Oh, and Tetzel even went so far as to encourage people to buy indulgences for their dead relatives. Hey, Aunt May and Uncle Jimbo, they're floating around in purgatory right now, but if if you pay me X amount of money and I give you this little slip of paper, they're magically going into heaven. And unfortunately, a lot of people believe this, and a lot of people sunk their money into it, and the church made a pretty penny off of this scam. Now, let's jump back to Martin Luther, okay? By this time, Martin Luther has left the monastery. He's graduated, if you will. He's a priest, he's a preacher, and he happens to be a university professor in Wittenberg, Germany. And Martin Luther is a very, very vocal critic of the church by this time. He regularly preaches against what he sees as the widespread corruption in the church. And really, this whole indulgences thing is kind of the last straw for him. His students and his congregation know him as a very vocal critic of the church, and now he takes his ideas, his criticisms of the church, and he puts them down on paper. On October 31st, 1517, Luther nails to the door of his church a document called the 95 Theses. The Theses, they're just statements. So basically, they're 95 statements that are criticizing the church. They criticize the sale of indulgences. They attack every other church policy that clashes with Luther's ideas of justification by faith. Now, let's remember, the printing press is a relatively new invention at this time. So with the printing press, copies of these 95 Theses will suddenly start to spread very, very quickly across Germany as more and more people become aware of Martin Luther and his arguments and his 95 Theses. He starts to sway a lot of people to his position on the matter. And as a result, the sale of indulgences really plunges. And the church takes notice, which is a good thing, and maybe not such a good thing if you're Martin Luther. The Pope at first tries to persuade Luther to withdraw his criticisms. And of course, Luther, devout and really solid in what he believes, refuses. Then Leo does what everyone had done to people like this throughout history. He bans Luther's works, brands him as a heretic, excommunicates him, and of course being branded as a heretic is essentially a death sentence. And so Martin Luther is now forced into hiding, having drawn the ire of the church. Luckily for Martin Luther, he happens to be in very good with some of the powerful nobles in Germany, and they give him a place to stay. He actually hides in one of the mountain castles of one of his German noble friends, and there in hiding, Martin Luther takes another step that's really going to upset the church. He translates the Bible. He translates the Bible into German. This is a big deal because it had always only been written in Latin, and only members of the church had been allowed to read it and interpret it. Again, benefiting from the printing press, his German translation of the Bible is able to be printed, reproduced, and spread far and wide throughout Northern Europe. And so people could now read the Bible and judge for themselves what they thought the stories meant without the interpretation of the Catholic Church's clergy. This is a big step for Martin Luther, and it's a big step for the Reformation movement because now more people have the ability to read and interpret the Bible for themselves and thus sort of form their own ideas and own beliefs on what Christianity and Catholicism and a relationship with God should be. And so Luther's actions, the 95 Theses, the translating of the Bible, his sort of views on Christianity, lead to the formation of the first Protestant faith, something called Lutheranism. And it's sort of an official, unofficial break with the Catholic Church. They're not talking about completely redoing Christianity, but it's Christianity in their own kind of way. And Luther's break with the Catholic Church spawns even more Protestant movements that are going to completely change the religious landscape of Europe. By the mid-1500s, Europe has now become religiously divided into a Protestant-dominated north and a Catholic-dominated South. The reason for the geographic divide is that because the South is closer to Rome, the Catholic Church, through things like the Inquisition and excommunication, are able to keep a closer grip on the southern part of Europe religiously. However, the northern part of Europe, being further separated from Rome and having the support of powerful German nobles, those people are able to accept sort of the Protestant break and be able to do as they please for the most part without fear of retribution from Rome. So Europe is now separated religiously into a Protestant North and a Catholic South. Way to go, Martin Luther. And as we're going to see in the future, the Protestant Reformation is not just about religion. It's going to become very political. It's going to lead to conflict. It's going to lead to bloodshed. It's not going to be just religion in the long run. All right, so there you have it, folks. We've seen the Protestant Reformation today, specifically how it was driven by the Renaissance, how the ideas and philosophies of the Renaissance led to calls for reformation within the Catholic Church. And then we met Martin Luther and saw how his actions began the Protestant Reformation and how the Protestant Reformation ultimately split Europe into a Protestant North and a Catholic South, with lots and lots and lots of religious and political conflict yet to come out of this in the future. All right, so those are the essential questions, guys. Study those. Be ready to discuss them the next time that we meet. And as always, until that time, I bid you farewell.